Long before her name was whispered in royal halls or carved in the memory of an empire, Cassandane was merely a child of Anshan, a daughter born not into power but into the shadows of those who pursued it. The air in the highlands of Elam was thick with dust and gods, and though Anshan was only a vassal kingdom within the sprawling Median orbit, its earth remembered the blood of warriors and the prayers of prophets. It was in this landscape of silent mountains and burning sun that Cassandane took her first breath, not knowing she would one day be the pulse behind the greatest empire the world had yet known. She came from a noble line of Achaemenid descent, one of the many bloodlines that claimed to hold the fire of kings in their veins. Her father was a lord of measured influence, a cautious man loyal to the political threads that kept Anshan intact under Median authority. Yet in Cassandane's household, it was not merely loyalty that shaped their days. It was legacy. They told stories in hushed tones, of ancestors who once defied empires, of ancestors who stood beside kings. They told of the old fire worshippers and of the new wisdom rising from the mountains of Persia. Cassandane listened, not merely to learn but to remember. Even as a child, she was not prone to laughter or distraction. She absorbed things, the murmurs of women in the weaving halls, the subtle shifts of tone when foreign envoys passed, the cold tremble in her mother's hands when news came of revolts or massacres in distant cities. The world beyond Anshan was trembling. The Medes held dominance, yes, but it was brittle. Under King Astyages, the court at Ecbatana was ornate and ceremonial, hiding a fraying reality. Alliances were forged not in honor but necessity. Blood was spilled not for glory but out of fear. Cassandane heard her father speak to guests in the evening, his voice taut with something unsaid. "The Medes are watching," he often whispered to his eldest son. "But so are the gods." Her education was uncommon for girls in her time. While her peers learned only domestic piety and quiet servitude, Cassandane's tutors came from Babylon, from Susa, from the fringes of Egypt. She was taught to read the cuneiform of Elam, the court scripts of Akkad, and the Proto-Persian chants of the fire priests. She memorized the laws of Hammurabi and debated the philosophies of Zoroaster long before those ideas had been bound into orthodoxy. But what defined her was not knowledge alone, it was her capacity for silence. She listened, and in that listening she became dangerous. The house of Anshan was a restless place, ever aware that its position beneath the Medes was both a privilege and a trap. When Cyrus was born, the boy who would become king, it was not yet known that destiny had chosen him. He was merely a child among many, a prince of minor standing, the grandson of Astyages through his mother, and the son of Cambyses I, a man noble but unremarkable in the greater schemes of the Median court. Yet from the moment she first saw him, Cassandane recognized in Cyrus a tension that mirrored her own. He was a boy of fire and restraint. He was polite when necessary, obedient when expected, but in his eyes there was always something watching, calculating. He was never fully still, never entirely present. It was as if he lived half in this world and half in the one he meant to build. Their union was not born of love, nor of politics, it was born of alignment. There was an understanding between them that defied explanation. When their marriage was arranged, it was not with pomp or ceremony. Few outside Anshan paid it any mind. Yet for those who knew the undercurrents of power, it was a moment of immense weight. Cassandane became his wife not as an ornament, but as a co-architect. In the quiet hours after their union, they did not speak of children or households. They spoke of borders, of Babylon, of Median spies, of the tension between fear and justice. Cyrus, though young, had already begun to envision something beyond the vassalage of his father, and Cassandane did not flinch. She did not warn him against ambition. She did not caution him to humility. Instead, she spoke of the old laws and the limits of cruelty. She asked not what kind of kingdom he wanted to rule, but what kind of king he dared to become. In the years that followed, as Cyrus began to navigate the delicate treachery of Median politics, Cassandane was his mirror. She reflected not only his strengths but the consequences of his weaknesses. She advised with the precision of a diplomat and the insight of a priestess. When Astyages, suspecting rebellion, began to close his grip on Anshan, it was Cassandane who read between the symbols in the letters from Ecbatana. She warned of betrayals cloaked in diplomacy, of emissaries who carried more poison than goodwill. She urged Cyrus to move quickly, to consolidate not only alliances but narratives, to shape how the people would remember him even before he rose. She knew that rebellion would come, and that when it did, it would not be a clash of swords alone. It would be a war of truths, a struggle over who held the moral right to rule. When Cyrus finally rose against Astyages, it was Cassandane who convinced the nobles of Anshan to risk their fortunes and families. It was she who soothed the priests and promised that a new order would preserve their temples. It was she who whispered to the widows of soldiers lost in early skirmishes, telling them their husbands had died not for power, but for justice. The fall of the Median Empire was swift, but it was not simple. It was Cassandane who ensured that Ecbatana would not burn. She forbade revenge upon Median loyalists. She insisted that Cyrus take not the crown of a conqueror but the mantle of a liberator. She helped him draft proclamations in languages not his own. She made certain that Babylon would hear of his restraint, that Lydia would see his wisdom, that Egypt would fear his reach not because of brutality, but because of inevitability. Even as Cyrus rose, Cassandane remained unseen by most. She did not seek titles, nor did she parade through cities. Her work was in letters, in negotiations, in rituals conducted at midnight. She met with foreign wives and emissaries in private chambers. She spoke to captives and priests. She wrote scrolls of law and rewrote them when they failed. She studied maps not for territory, but for patterns of rebellion. She sent gifts to villages Cyrus would never see, knowing that loyalty could be bought more efficiently with grain and compassion than with gold or death. She bore children, but even motherhood did not distract her from her greater labor. She saw in her sons not princes to be pampered, but future leaders to be molded. Cambyses, her eldest, inherited her severity but lacked her vision. Bardia, younger, had the gentleness she feared would be crushed by politics. In both, she sowed the seeds of order, praying that the empire they would inherit would be worthy of them. Cassandane never wore a crown. She never led an army. Her name did not echo in foreign courts, nor was it inscribed on monuments in her lifetime. Yet she was the breath in Cyrus's speech, the pause in his fury, the weight behind his mercy. And as the empire began to take shape, stretching its fingers across the deserts and rivers of the known world, Cassandane remained at its heart, unseen, steady, and irrevocably necessary. In her chamber, surrounded by scrolls and silence, she kept records not of battles, but of decisions. She wrote of what had been spared, not what had been taken. She recorded the names of tribes who submitted peacefully, the temples preserved, the children fed in famine. She did not see herself as a queen, but as a guardian of equilibrium. She believed, with the faith of fire and stone, that power meant responsibility, and that empire meant duty to the unseen. And thus, while history would call Cyrus great, those who knew the quiet corners of the empire would remember that greatness was not born in a battlefield. It was born in a chamber of candlelight, where a woman with steady hands and an unshakable heart dared to imagine a world not built on fear, but on dignity. There were nights when Cassandane could not sleep, when the winds over the dry highlands of Anshan howled like ancestral voices warning of storms that would come not from the sky but from the hearts of men. She had learned to recognize such nights, not as omens to be feared but as truths pressing upon her mind. The empire was growing, though it had not yet named itself as such. Cyrus had overcome the weight of his grandfather's throne and seized Ecbatana without drenching the stones in unnecessary blood. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the breath before something deeper, something far more enduring than conquest. It was the space in which foundations are laid or destroyed. Cassandane spent these hours alone, away from the laughter of servants or the clang of guards sharpening blades. She walked the tiled corridors of the new palace, still smelling of Median oils and old dynasties. She paused beneath the strange archways, decorated with the symbols of deities long subdued by fire worship and reform. Though Cyrus now held power over Media, the land itself had not submitted. The people nodded in ritual, not reverence. The priests muttered prayers not to Ahura Mazda, but to the gods of sky and storm. Cassandane knew such dissonance could unravel even the most formidable rule. And so, she sought a different kind of dominion, not over territory but over belief. Her mind returned often to the words of an old fire priest, a man once considered half-mad, exiled from Anshan before she was born. His teachings had drifted through the halls of her youth like mist, never spoken aloud, but always felt. He had warned of an age when kings would believe themselves gods, when conquest would outpace comprehension, and when only those who could wield both fire and iron with justice would endure. That prophecy had etched itself into her consciousness like a brand. And now, as the daughter of a noble house and the wife of an empire's architect, she saw its shapes becoming real. Cyrus was no longer simply a man. He was a figure woven into stories already, some accurate, some deliberately shaped by his court. He was the king who conquered Media without razing its cities, who offered terms before threats, who allowed the conquered to pray in their own tongues. But power has gravity, and Cassandane could feel its pull on her husband's soul. Each new province came with new voices whispering flattery, new gold gilding the records, and new burdens on his time, pulling him away not only from her but from the clarity they once shared. It was in this shifting landscape that Cassandane began to plan, not for war, but for order. She knew the kingdom Cyrus now ruled was too vast to be governed by might alone. The borderlands stretched beyond what messengers could travel in a single moon's passing. The languages differed so vastly that a proclamation in one tongue might incite loyalty in one region and rebellion in another. If Cyrus was to endure, if his vision was to survive him, then a system must be built, one not dependent on charisma or fear but on coherence. She began with the priests. Religion, she knew, had always outlasted armies. It dictated customs, rhythms, and morality. A unified belief could bind peoples who would otherwise resent one another. Yet Cassandane also understood the peril of forced faith. Her strategy was not to impose but to absorb. She invited elders from Babylon, fire priests from Persis, scholars from the Elamite cities. She listened more than she spoke. She let them teach her not only their rituals but their fears. What she discovered was not a clash of gods but a shared desire for stability. They all feared chaos more than they distrusted each other. Cassandane began drafting a code, a charter of coexistence, never officially named but whispered among the learned. In it, she proposed guidelines for religious freedom within the boundaries of law, respect for ancestral customs as long as they did not undermine justice, and recognition of sacred spaces regardless of their pantheon. She presented this to Cyrus not as a command, but as an idea birthed from the soil of his own conquests. He read her work not once but many times. When he began to incorporate its principles into his governance, he did so in his own way, never acknowledging its authorship. Cassandane did not care. What mattered was that it was happening. As this quiet revolution took root, the world beyond Anshan began to stir. From the west came reports of Lydia, a kingdom rich not only in gold but in cunning. Its king, Croesus, had once been an ally to the Medes and now regarded Cyrus with suspicion masked as civility. Cassandane had never met Croesus, but she knew his type. He was the kind of ruler who believed wealth was wisdom, who mistook flattery for diplomacy. He would not attack openly, but he would plant seeds. He would fund resistance. He would bait Cyrus with opportunities masked as gifts. It was Cassandane who insisted on patience. She urged Cyrus to send emissaries, not armies, to learn the rhythms of Lydia. She advised that spies be placed not among soldiers, but among merchants and priests. She reminded him that the greatest victories were often won long before swords were drawn. He listened, as he always had, but Cassandane sensed something shifting. He had tasted the power of conquest and found it intoxicating. Even a wise man can lose balance when the world begins to kneel. During these years, Cassandane bore a second child, a daughter she named Atossa. While the empire looked to Cyrus as its son, Cassandane found in her children the legacy she truly believed in, not the expansion of borders, but the preservation of integrity. She raised Atossa not as a princess, but as a student. She taught her the old dialects and the new laws. She showed her how to read not only scripts, but faces. She told her not the stories of kings, but of women who kept kingdoms alive during times of famine and siege. In Atossa's eyes, she saw the promise of continuity, not of bloodline, but of values. The nights remained restless. Cassandane dreamed often of fire consuming cities she had never seen, of iron melting into rivers. In one such vision, she stood atop a mountain, watching as smoke rose from distant temples, and she heard a voice not her own whisper, "He will conquer the world, but not himself." She woke with her hands clenched and her breath ragged. She did not speak of these dreams to Cyrus. Instead, she wrote them down, sealed them in scrolls, and hid them in the walls of the temple she had helped restore in Anshan. Outside, the empire's rhythms grew louder. Troops trained in larger numbers. Roads were carved deeper into the mountains. Gold from conquered lands was minted with Cyrus's name. His face appeared on carvings, his titles multiplied. King of Media, King of Persia, King of the four corners of the earth. Cassandane read these inscriptions with pride but also unease. Titles she knew were tombstones waiting for names. She reminded herself, again and again, that her role was not to resist the tide, but to shape its flow. The prophecy she had remembered in her youth of fire and iron was no longer an abstraction. It had become her daily work. She forged alliances with the tools of empathy and foresight. She extinguished fires of rebellion before they could blaze. She wielded iron in the form of discipline, not violence. Her power remained invisible to most, but its effects could be traced in the stability of newly governed lands, in the quiet satisfaction of priests whose temples remained unburned, in the smiles of orphans who received grain instead of whips. And always she watched Cyrus. She watched the way his posture stiffened after each victory, the way his voice deepened when he addressed his generals. She watched his eyes, searching for the boy she had once married. He was still there, but farther away now, cloaked in the weight of expectation. She did not try to bring him back. She simply stood beside him, a silent constant, a compass hidden beneath layers of ceremony and stone. Cassandane understood what many queens never did, that power does not change men. It reveals them. And what it revealed in Cyrus was not cruelty or arrogance, but hunger. A hunger not for domination, but for meaning. He conquered not because he loved war, but because he feared stagnation. He expanded not to accumulate riches, but to build a world that would not collapse into the one he had overthrown. In that, they were united. She built in silence, he built in spectacle, but both dreamed of the same thing, a realm not merely ruled, but respected. An empire not only of borders, but of belief. And so, as the fires of ambition roared and the iron of rule cooled into law, Cassandane continued her work. For she knew that prophecies are not destinies, but warnings. And she intended to make sure that this one would end not in ruin, but in light. There comes a moment in the life of every empire when the past must be severed to allow the future to take root. In the lands of the ancient East, where mountains rose like the bones of old gods and winds carried not only dust but secrets, such a moment was stirring. The Median Empire, once proud and ironclad, stood on the precipice of dissolution, its crown no longer a symbol of enduring strength but a relic of arrogance and fear. Cassandane, who had spent her life studying not only the men who wore crowns but the systems that upheld them, recognized the signs with clarity before most dared speak them. To the world, Cyrus was the figure poised to challenge the old order, but within the quiet chambers of Anshan, Cassandane was already dismantling the mythology that kept the Medes in power. She understood that before a kingdom could fall by sword, it had to first crumble in the minds of its subjects. Astyages, the last king of Media, reigned with opulence and suspicion. His court had become a theater of paranoia, where informants outnumbered advisors and rituals replaced wisdom. What was once a throne supported by alliances now rested on trembling scaffolds of fear and brittle loyalty. Cassandane's preparation was not born in bloodshed but in subtle architecture. She began with the families, noble houses once loyal to the Median line but now disillusioned by stagnation. She hosted them under the guise of sacred festivals and marriages, speaking not of rebellion but of restoration. Her words were cautious, framed as questions rather than convictions, yet they planted the seeds of doubt. Is a king who fears his people still a king? She asked one matriarch behind a curtain of incense. Can a tree that no longer bears fruit still cast the same shade? At the same time, Cassandane worked to solidify the moral imperative of their cause. It was not enough to seize power. They had to justify it in the eyes of those who would inherit the consequences. She gathered scholars and priests, not to fabricate lies, but to interpret omens and texts that pointed toward transition. She funded the transcription of forgotten prophecies and ensured their distribution across the temples and markets of key cities. Soon, stories began to circulate of a ruler destined to unite the divided lands, not through force, but through divine justice. The people needed a reason to hope. She gave them one. Meanwhile, Cyrus prepared the military dimensions of their uprising, moving cautiously to avoid provoking Astyages before the web was complete. He consolidated troops under loyal commanders, many of whom Cassandane had personally vetted, and established secret channels of communication between Anshan and the provinces that chafed under Median taxes and mandates. But even with strategy and steel, there remained uncertainty, for Astyages was not without his own power. His army was large, his capital fortified, and his spies embedded deeply. Then came the fateful defection. Harpagus, a high-ranking general once loyal to Astyages, reached out through intermediaries. Years earlier, Astyages had ordered him to carry out an atrocity, an act so vile that its memory had fermented into treachery. Now, Harpagus offered Cyrus not only his loyalty but access to the inner structure of the Median army. Cassandane, ever cautious, insisted on verification. She orchestrated tests of communication and loyalty that Harpagus passed with careful precision. With him came critical intelligence. The movements of Median troops, the weaknesses of supply lines, the morale of Astyages' inner court. Cassandane knew the moment had come not because of the defection, but because of the silence that followed. Rumors halted. Festivals grew smaller. Astyages ceased sending emissaries. In her experience, this was the sound of fear calcifying into action. The Median king would strike not from confidence, but from desperation. Cyrus mobilized. The war began not with trumpets, but with messages carried on the backs of horses in the dead of night. Provinces rose in unison, tearing down the sigils of Ecbatana and replacing them with symbols long buried. Battles broke out along the borders, swift and surgical. What Astyages had expected to be an isolated rebellion quickly revealed itself as a coordinated unraveling. In the midst of the campaign, Cassandane remained in Anshan, orchestrating the home front. She organized supply lines and oversaw the transport of grain and medicine. She issued decrees in Cyrus's name that ensured discipline and prevented chaos. But her greatest contribution came in the realm of perception. She flooded the cities with proclamations of liberation, not conquest. She had artists paint murals of Cyrus flanked by priests, not soldiers. She had scribes document the fall of Median cruelty and the rise of a new ethical order. In doing so, she reshaped not just the reality, but the memory of the war even as it was unfolding. Ecbatana, the Median capital, did not fall in a blaze of fire, fell in a whisper. Astyages, betrayed and surrounded, surrendered without glory. The once mighty king was taken not in chains, but in solemn procession. Cyrus, at Cassandane's urging, spared his life and housed him in comfort until the end of his days. It was an act that shocked the world. Kings who were overthrown were expected to be executed, humiliated, erased. But Cyrus offered a new model, one in which mercy amplified strength, and restraint demonstrated sovereignty. This philosophy bore Cassandane's fingerprints more than any general's sword. In the days that followed the fall, Cassandane entered Ecbatana for the first time, not as a conqueror, but as a steward. She walked its ancient halls, noting the broken idols, the tapestries faded with decades of decay, the gardens overgrown. She ordered that the royal archives be preserved and translated, not destroyed. She commissioned the repair of temples, even those that worshipped foreign gods. She declared a week of mourning, not for the Median regime, but for the lost promise of what it had once aspired to be. In this, she distinguished their rule not by the crown they had taken, but by the future they intended to build. With Media under control, the path forward seemed limitless. But Cassandane understood what Cyrus did not yet see, that the conquest of Media was not the end of rebellion, but the beginning of responsibility. Their rule would be tested not in the taking of cities, but in the tending of them. An empire of swords might win battles, but only an empire of laws and compassion could endure. She returned to Anshan with a heavy heart, not from doubt, but from understanding. In the triumph of Cyrus, she saw the beginning of a new strain in his spirit, a flicker of confidence that could, if left unchecked, grow into hubris. He had won not just a war, but the adoration of a people hungry for order. It was a power more intoxicating than any wine. She resolved then to remain vigilant, to continue serving as both compass and weight, to ensure that the man who had unseated a king did not become one in spirit. In private, she began to write reflections not meant for publication or policy, but for the future, letters to her children, records of decisions made and motives behind them. She chronicled not the battles, but the principles that justified them. She wrote of justice as a living force, not a static law. She wrote of leadership as a burden, not a reward. She wrote of Cyrus not as a hero, but as a man whose greatness depended entirely on his ability to remain human. And so, while the world celebrated the birth of a new empire, Cassandane prepared for its adolescence, the slow, uncertain process of becoming. She knew that an empire founded on vision could still be undone by blindness, and she intended to keep its eyes open, even if it meant sacrificing her comfort, her name, or her place in the stories that would follow. Because Cassandane never needed history to remember her. She needed only for the empire to last. The fall of the Median crown did not end with the scattering of its armies or the surrender of Astyages. It ended with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the expectant hush of a world watching for what would come next. The cities of Media waited, not to see how they would be ruled, but to learn who they had become under new rule. In that fragile interim between conquest and consolidation, Cassandane understood what few did, that empires were not born of victory but of voice. And if this newborn realm stretching across the mountains of Elam and the plains of Media was to survive, it would have to learn to speak many languages without losing its soul. The diversity of the lands now under Cyrus's rule was unprecedented. From the Zagros Mountains to the fringes of the Caspian Sea, from river towns clinging to ancient traditions to urban centers humming with administrative ritual, the populations differed not only in language but in belief, in memory, in expectation. To rule them with a singular voice was to ask for resistance. To rule them with silence was to invite chaos. It would take something new, something the old empires had never dared. Unity without uniformity. Cassandane saw it first in the letters. She had instructed her scribes to begin collecting not only the reports of governors and generals, but the language they used. It was more than translation. It was rhythm, metaphor, imagery. From Susa came proclamations steeped in agricultural metaphors, power as fertility, justice as water. From Ecbatana, the rhetoric was steeped in cosmic order, with kings described as constellations and rebellion as a break in the heavenly sphere. From distant villages, she received chants and prayers passed orally for generations, now hastily scrawled by scribes learning to write for the first time. She studied these with the care of a surgeon. The words revealed more than the people's thoughts. They revealed their fears, their dreams, and most importantly, the way they wanted to be seen. A ruler who could not hear those voices would never command loyalty, only obedience, and obedience, she knew, was brittle. In the council chambers of Anshan, where Cyrus and his closest advisors gathered to plan the next stage of expansion, Cassandane's influence was often indirect but never absent. She rarely spoke before generals, but her writings, her briefs, and her coded recommendations passed through Cyrus's hands daily. She encouraged him to adopt not a language of superiority, but one of stewardship. The empire, she argued, should be presented not as a force of domination but as a custodian of many peoples, each valuable, each distinct. She pushed for a policy that would seem radical even in later centuries. Administrative multilingualism. Official decrees would be issued not in a single tongue, but in the languages of the regions they governed. Translators would be trained not only in vocabulary but in cultural nuance. Taxes would be calculated according to local customs, not imposed uniformly. Local priests, chieftains, and elders would retain ceremonial roles, provided they did not disrupt the broader harmony. Cyrus, pragmatic as ever, adopted the policy not out of sentiment but strategy. He saw what Cassandane had already grasped, that giving them status within the imperial framework while carefully limiting their power. The result was a balance few empires had managed. Centralized vision with decentralized empathy. It was not without resistance. Some in the inner court feared that too much tolerance would be seen as weakness. Others complained that the cost of training interpreters and printing edicts in multiple scripts was wasteful. She had scribes compile reports of rebellions suppressed by force versus regions calmed by concession. Time and again, the numbers showed that loyalty bought with dignity cost less in coin and blood than loyalty forced through fear. Still, managing so many voices required a new infrastructure. Cassandane proposed the creation of a central record office, not simply for tax rolls or military logs, but for language itself. A place where dialects could be studied, where local myths could be preserved, and soon a modest stone building near Pasargadae began collecting the words of 1,000 tribes. In private, Cassandane worried about the cost, not the material expense but the spiritual weight. Diversity, while beautiful, was fragile. Misunderstandings between cultures had caused wars more often than ambition. The wrong word, the wrong gesture, the wrong name on a document could undo months of diplomacy. She began personally training a cadre of scribes, not just to copy, but to listen. She taught them to ask questions, to observe festivals, to map not only the roads but the relationships between people and the gods they served. One of her greatest challenges came from within Persia itself. Among the nobility of Anshan, there were those who believed Persia's dominance entitled it to cultural supremacy. They viewed the new policies as betrayal and erosion of identity. Cassandane met this with patient firmness. She reminded them that Persia had never been great because it erased others, but because it had absorbed them without losing its center. She cited old traditions of hospitality, the deep respect for ancestry, the reverence for spoken truth. In doing so, she redefined Persian pride not as a blunt instrument, but as a resilient thread woven through many fabrics. The growing empire brought her new correspondences, letters from women in distant provinces who heard of the queen who read scrolls and governed with words instead of swords. They sent her songs, recipes, tales of childbirth and mourning, questions about justice and ritual. Cassandane answered as many as she could. Not all letters were returned with policy, but each was met with acknowledgement. To be heard, she knew, was often more powerful than being helped. In her own court, she began celebrating a new kind of festival, not dedicated to a single god, but to the concept of the spoken word. Bards from across the empire were invited to recite their poems, often in languages the audience did not understand. The point was not comprehension, but communion. Cassandane wanted her people to feel, viscerally, the beauty of what was foreign. She wanted them to see not enemies in unfamiliar tongues, but neighbors. Meanwhile, Cyrus turned his eyes westward, toward Lydia, where gold flowed through rivers and the famed Croesus reigned with wealth unmatched. Plans for engagement began in whispers, then in strategy. Cassandane prepared accordingly. She had already begun gathering linguistic samples from Lydian traders, observing their iconography and metaphors. She suspected that Croesus would not yield to fear. He would yield, if at all, to a narrative in which submission preserved honor. She drafted for Cyrus a manifesto, to be read not only in Lydia, but across the empire. It declared that the Achaemenid order was not an enemy of local tradition, but its protector. Promised not erasure, but elevation. And though Cyrus added his flourishes, talk of unity and destiny, it was Cassandane's vision that framed the core. As the empire pushed forward, its maps redrawn in broader sweeps, Cassandane kept her focus on the words that connected each corner to the heart. She knew that power moved faster than culture, and that unless someone kept pace with the meanings people made of their world, the empire would fracture. She understood that, in a kingdom of many tongues, the role of a queen was not to speak for them, but to ensure that each voice could be heard without shouting over the others. In the quiet hours, she wrote again in her private scrolls. Not of policy, but of memory. She recorded the moments when empathy had prevented war, the names of local leaders who had chosen peace, the phrases in forgotten dialects that captured entire philosophies. She wrote because she knew that one day, the words might be all that remained. And so, while Cyrus expanded his reach across deserts and rivers, Cassandane built something just as vast, an empire of meaning, not carved in stone, but etched in breath, in ink, in the minds of those who had been taught not only to obey, but to believe. There are moments in history when the wealth of a kingdom becomes its burden, when the gleam of gold blinds not only those who seek it, but those who possess it. Was a figure of legend even before Cyrus turned his gaze westward. His riches were spoken of in markets and temples, his generosity recited in poetry and rumor, his name synonymous not with power, but with opulence. And yet, beneath the surface of marble columns and golden offerings, Cassandane recognized the familiar symptoms of a fragile regime, one whose foundations had been laid in vanity rather than vision. She had never seen Lydia, but she knew its textures intimately through the reports she collected and the letters she analyzed. The traders from Sardis carried more than spices and dyes. They carried metaphors. They spoke of their king in terms of myth, of divine favor, of destiny ordained not by conquest, but by commerce. Croesus, in their language, was not a ruler but a chosen vessel through whom the gods funneled prosperity. It was a dangerous mythology, not because it was false, but because it allowed no space for correction. A king who believes he cannot fall rarely takes the steps to ensure he doesn't. Cassandane had grown wary of Cyrus's growing fascination with Lydia. The stories of Croesus's generosity reached Anshan wrapped in admiration, but she read them as challenges. Generosity, she knew, was not always a virtue. Often it was a mask for insecurity, a mechanism of control. Croesus bought loyalty not with justice, but with spectacle. He kept his court pleased with gifts, his gods satisfied with sacrifice, and his enemies at bay with bribes. But the world was shifting, and such tricks no longer held. Persia was no longer a distant shadow. It was a force of law, order, and principle. And for men like Croesus, the mere existence of such an empire was a provocation. Tensions rose slowly, like water beneath a frozen lake. Cyrus sent envoys, ostensibly to discuss trade, but the undertone of each letter was unmistakable. Persia was not interested in wealth, it was interested in permanence. Croesus responded in kind, offering lavish tokens but no concessions. He viewed Cyrus not as a threat but as an upstart. It was the mistake of a man who had never been truly challenged. And it was the kind of error Cassandane feared most, the one born of pride. She prepared in parallel to Cyrus's strategy. While he consulted generals and cartographers, she studied the economic structures of Lydia. She commissioned analyses of Sardis's gold reserves, its taxation systems, its merchant networks. She traced the paths of wealth and looked for weaknesses. Every economy, she knew, had a rhythm, and if that rhythm could be disrupted, even the richest kingdom could collapse from within. She also turned her attention to the people. Lydia was a kingdom of vast disparities. The wealth of Croesus did not trickle evenly. In the towns beyond the palace walls, farmers paid tithes they could barely afford, and soldiers guarded borders with wages diminished by inflation. Cassandane recognized that this imbalance, while not openly volatile, created the perfect soil for discontent. All that was needed was a catalyst, something to break the illusion of Croesus's invincibility. That catalyst came not from Cyrus, but from the gods, or so it was said. An earthquake struck the western provinces of Lydia, toppling temples and fracturing aqueducts. Croesus responded with offerings, sacrifices, public displays of devotion, but the people saw what Cassandane had anticipated. A king who had no plan, only rituals. Cyrus, on the other hand, sent physicians, builders, and caravans of grain, not to Lydia, but to the neighboring states that had felt the tremors. The gesture was not only compassionate, it was strategic. Border towns began to question their allegiances. They saw in Persia not a conqueror, but a redeemer. When the war finally came, it was not with the inevitability of storms, but with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Cyrus marched westward with a force measured not only in size but in cohesion. His troops were not drawn from a single province, but from every corner of the empire, each contingent speaking its own tongue, yet bound by shared principles and a common banner. Cassandane watched them depart with the calm of a woman who had built the spirit that carried them forward. She did not fear for Cyrus's survival. She feared for the cost of his victory. The siege of Sardis was swift by the standards of history, but long by the standards of those who lived it. Croesus had retreated behind his city's walls, confident in their strength. But walls, Cassandane often said, protect nothing if the people inside them no longer believe. Cyrus's engineers, trained under programs she had helped standardize, found the vulnerabilities. They undermined, not with brute force, but with water, diverting rivers, saturating foundations, breaking the city's confidence before breaking its stone. When Sardis fell, Cassandane issued a decree before Cyrus could reach the palace. It forbade the looting of homes, the desecration of temples, and the enslavement of citizens. Cyrus honored it not out of deference, but because he understood its purpose. Lydia would not be made Persian by violence. It would be invited into something larger. The gold of Croesus was seized, yes, but not flaunted. It was absorbed, catalogued, and much of it reinvested in the infrastructure of the empire. Roads were built, schools were founded, markets were regulated. Sardis became not a symbol of conquest, but of integration. Croesus himself was spared, a decision that shocked many and gratified few. He was brought before Cyrus, stripped of power but not of dignity. Some say he later advised the king, others that he lived in quiet exile. Cassandane ensured that he was treated not as a prisoner, but as a relic, a man preserved not for use but for memory. She believed deeply that how one treated the fallen spoke louder than how one celebrated the victorious. The aftermath of Lydia's fall rippled across the known world. Egypt tightened its borders. Babylon took note. In the taverns and temples, people no longer whispered of Cyrus as a conqueror. They spoke of him as a force of nature, a man who moved through kingdoms not to destroy, but to remake. Cassandane knew the narrative would not always remain so noble. Power, once solidified, attracted suspicion. But for now, she nurtured the myth, not for its vanity, but for its utility. Back in Anshan, she resumed her quiet labor. She met with the wives of generals, ensuring their households remained stable, easing their fears and offering them a place within the imperial religious council. She commissioned translations of Lydian literature, not to preserve it as artifact, but to introduce it to Persian schools. She wanted her people to see Lydia not as a conquered foe, but as a chapter in their collective story. She often thought of gold, not the metal itself, but the illusion it created. Croesus had ruled with gold and been blinded by it. Cyrus had taken it, but only because Cassandane had taught him to look through it. She had shown him that true wealth was not stored in vaults, but in the ability to govern without resentment, in the unity of strangers, in the peace that followed the storm. And so, as the empire gleamed with newfound richness, Cassandane continued to live simply. Her robes were modest, her chamber unadorned, but her reach extended into every scroll, every school, every treaty that bound this growing world together. The gold of Croesus had entered the empire, but it was Cassandane who decided what it would become. Long before the banners of Cyrus fluttered over the temples of Babylon, the great city had already cast its shadow over the minds of all who dreamed of empire. It was not simply a place. It was an idea, an echo of power too vast to ignore. The Euphrates did not just feed the fields and gardens that sprawled beyond its gates. It fed the pride of a civilization that saw itself not as one among many, but as the heart of the world. For Cassandane, the name Babylon carried more than historical weight. It carried questions. Of all the cities that had knelt to kings and gods, this was the one most practiced in the art of survival. And survival, she knew, could disguise itself in loyalty just as easily as in resistance. In the years that followed Lydia's fall, the empire Cyrus and Cassandane had built began to breathe in longer rhythms. Provinces no longer cracked under the weight of administration. Roads carried messages as swiftly as armies had once carried conquest. Coins bearing Cyrus's likeness circulated not as symbols of dominance, but as instruments of trust. And yet, Cassandane could sense the pressure building, like water behind a dam that no one dared name. Babylon, though formally allied through a delicate dance of diplomacy, remained untouched. It was the final, unavoidable node in the network of ancient power that must be absorbed or else forever threaten the body of the empire from within. The Babylonian court was an elaborate construction of priesthoods and provincial governors, of old bloodlines and newer opportunists. Its king, Nabonidus, was not so much a ruler as he was a theologian, a man more interested in elevating his favored moon god, Sin, than in the political or economic health of his state. In his absence, power often fell into the hands of his son, Belshazzar, whose reputation for extravagance rivaled that of Croesus but lacked his political savvy. Still, Babylon had endured worse kings and survived. Its true strength lay in the ziggurats, the temples, and the mythos. Babylon was sacred to its people not because of who ruled it, but because of what it had been. Cassandane approached the challenge not with the arrogance of conquest, but with the humility of history. She instructed her scribes to study the rituals of the Babylonian priesthood, not just their doctrines, but their calendars, their poetry, the cadence of their hymns. She sought not to convert Babylon, but to understand the axis around which its culture turned. In the palace gardens of Pasargadae, she often walked alone, reciting from memory the names of the Babylonian gods: Ishtar, Marduk, Nabu. She did not believe in them, but she believed in what they meant to those who did. Meanwhile, Cyrus prepared for more than diplomacy. He sent agents not to threaten, but to listen. What they reported was troubling. Temples had grown quiet. Merchants complained in private of taxes that choked trade. The people did not rise in rebellion, but they whispered in markets and behind closed doors. The divine aura of Babylon remained intact, but its foundations were slowly rotting. Cassandane recognized the opportunity but also the danger. A kingdom might accept a conqueror if he promised peace, but a sacred city, wounded by pride, might choose death over submission. And so began one of the most delicate maneuvers in the history of empire, not a war in the traditional sense, but a campaign of perception. Cassandane curated the image of Cyrus not as a foreign king, but as a chosen restorer. She composed letters to Babylonian priests using their own invocations, praising the wisdom of Marduk, pledging to restore the temples neglected by Nabonidus. She had Persian messengers wear robes dyed in Mesopotamian patterns. She ordered public readings in Aramaic, the lingua franca of the region, extolling Cyrus not as a rival to Babylon but as the fulfillment of its divine legacy. At the same time, she crafted subtle propaganda within the empire itself. Poems circulated in marketplaces, stories of a city whose gods had turned away, whose king had abandoned his people to chase phantoms in the desert. Artists carved images of Cyrus lifting broken walls, feeding orphans, restoring law. These were not lies, but they were carefully edited truths. The goal was not to conquer Babylon by sword, but to erode the myth that it could not be conquered. The military plan followed quietly. Cyrus did not storm the city. He did not challenge its gods or defile its temples. Instead, he moved along the river, manipulating its flow, cutting off supplies without triggering alarms. His troops engaged only when necessary, often welcomed as liberators by villages long abandoned by their central government. And then, when the time was right, Babylon opened, not with a cry of defiance, but with a sigh of exhaustion. Nabonidus fled. Belshazzar vanished from the records, his fate unrecorded or deliberately obscured. And Cyrus walked into Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a guest. The priests met him with ritual, the people with silence, the city with an eerie calm that defied centuries of resistance. Cassandane, back in Anshan, received the news not with triumph, but with gravity. She understood what Cyrus had entered was not a palace, but a sanctuary. To rule Babylon was not to add another jewel to a crown. It was to inherit a weight that could either anchor or drown. She immediately dispatched emissaries to oversee the transition, not generals, but scholars and priests trained under her guidance. Their orders were explicit: restore the temples, honor the gods, feed the hungry, rebuild the archives. Babylon was to be treated not as a subject, but as a sacred trust. When Cyrus issued his now famous declaration allowing displaced peoples, including the Jews exiled generations before, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, it bore the signature of his mercy. But it bore the fingerprint of Cassandane's vision. The world took notice. Kings and merchants, rebels and sages, all saw what Persia had done, not simply with armies but with ideas. It had turned conquest into invitation, rule into ritual, dominion into stewardship. Cassandane's concept of empire, once dismissed as idealism, was now reality. The tablets etched with these decrees were not only political documents, they were artifacts of a new kind of power. And yet, the victory did not come without cost. Cassandane could feel it in the voice of Cyrus when they spoke in private, in the letters he sent her from Babylon. He was tired, not in body but in spirit. The weight of peace, she realized, was heavier than the sword. Maintaining balance among so many peoples, so many gods, so many truths, required a constant act of performance. The lines between ruler and actor, between justice and expedience, blurred. She began writing again in the privacy of her chambers. Not scrolls for the court or proclamations for the provinces, but personal reflections. Notes for Atossa, for Cambyses, for the unnamed generations who would one day inherit this living, breathing empire. She wrote of what Babylon had taught them, that greatness was not in how high walls rose or how gold shimmered, but in how quietly one could enter a sacred place and still be welcomed. In one entry, she described a vision she had never spoken aloud. In it, she stood on the banks of the Euphrates at dusk. The city behind her was silent, the river calm. In the sky, the stars formed not constellations, but words in languages she did not know. She understood none of them, but she felt their meaning. Guard this, they said, not with fear, not with pride, but with love. And so, as the Euphrates continued its endless journey, slipping past the temples and ruins and new roads of a city now called Persian, Cassandane remained the still point at the center of a vast and shifting world. She had helped take Babylon without fire. She had helped rewrite the meaning of empire. And in the shadows that stretched from the great river to the edge of the known world, her influence lingered, quiet, unwavering, necessary. The empire had become a constellation of beliefs. from the ice-touched foothills of the Hindu Kush to the sun-scorched plains of Syria, from the ziggurats of Babylon to the fire temples of Persia. The people of Cyrus's world bowed before gods both named and nameless. And though the banners bore the seal of Achaemenid rule, it was not a single god or creed or tongue that stitched the empire together. It was something less visible, more delicate, and infinitely more difficult to maintain. It was the illusion that all these forces, wild, ancient, contradictory, could exist beneath one order. It was an empire of permission, not uniformity. And it was Cassandane who had shaped its soul. She had not set out to become the guardian of 1,000 gods. Her own faith remained rooted in the ancient fire worship of her ancestors, in the silent rituals of purification, in the reverence of light and truth and balance. But as the empire expanded and the temples multiplied, she realized that to preserve her own beliefs, she would have to protect those of others. She had seen too many thrones crumble under the weight of enforced orthodoxy. What endured was not dogma, but dignity. In Babylon, where her influence had grown through the measured restoration of sacred rites, Cassandane became known not by her Persian titles, but by an epithet whispered in temples and markets alike: the queen who listens. It was not meant as flattery, it was a description born of observation. She listened to complaints that others dismissed. She listened to fears that others punished. She listened to priests whose gods she did not worship. And in listening, she created something that few had ever imagined possible: reverence without conquest. In the first year after Babylon's peaceful capitulation, Cassandane formalized a council that would become one of the most quietly transformative organs of the empire, the Assembly of Temples. It was not a legislative body, nor did it possess military power. It possessed something rarer: legitimacy across faiths. Representatives from various priesthoods, Zoroastrians, Chaldeans, Arameans, Elamites, and others, were invited to send scholars and emissaries. The purpose was not to unify beliefs, but to mediate conflicts, share rituals, and advise the royal court on matters of spiritual consequence. Cyrus, while politically supportive, had little patience for metaphysical debate. He recognized the council's value but left its operation largely to Cassandane. She presided not as a priestess, but as a custodian. She did not vote. She did not impose. She convened. She recorded. She reminded. She gave the assembled clerics what none of them had enjoyed under previous regimes: a common forum and protection under law. The effects were immediate. Temples previously at odds began to coordinate festival dates. Agricultural calendars were synchronized. Marriage rites were recognized across linguistic lines. Superstition gave way, gradually, to ritual cohesion. And more than that, the people, many of them illiterate, many traumatized by centuries of shifting tyrannies, began to sense that their gods, old as they were, had not been erased, but elevated. Cassandane did not romanticize the work. She knew that harmony could fray at any moment. There were uprisings. There were prophets who decried pluralism as heresy. There were governors who chafed at temples receiving imperial protection. And there were priests, even within the council, who sought not peace but dominance. But she managed these fractures the way she had always managed power: quietly, surgically, without spectacle. She isolated fanatics by giving voice to moderates. She strengthened temples that offered education and food. She redirected royal funding not based on theology, but on service. Her own position remained ambiguous. She refused elevation to priestess, despite being begged by many Zoroastrian elders to formally represent the faith. She chose, instead, to remain within the secular margins of influence, never commanding, always persuading. She attended temple rituals not as a sovereign, but as a supplicant. Her presence was neither perfumed with sanctimony nor dulled by apathy. She was simply there, consistent, reverent, and attentive. At court, Cassandane's reputation became both a shield and a cipher. Foreign dignitaries brought offerings not to curry favor, but to show respect for her work. Some offered scrolls of their sacred texts, others sent rare incense or tapestries depicting their myths. She accepted them all and displayed none. Her private chambers remained unadorned, her altar bare save for a modest flame and a polished stone bearing the words Asha, truth. Yet she understood the power of symbols, and she used them with precision. When a drought struck the eastern provinces and a local oracle blamed foreign gods, Cassandane personally dispatched grain shipments to the region, carried by priests of 3 different faiths. When the rains returned, she did not take credit. She allowed the people to draw their own conclusions. Most did, and those conclusions became loyalty. Not everyone approved. In Persia, whispers emerged, among conservative nobles, among fire-worshipping purists. Some accused her of weakening the empire's identity, of diluting its soul with foreign dust. Cassandane did not respond publicly, but she doubled the educational stipend for temple schools, including those in the most traditional Persian provinces. She understood that dissent was not always disloyalty. It was fear in disguise. And fear, she had learned, could be softened by proximity to knowledge. Still, she watched Cyrus with increasing concern. Though he remained true to the principles they had shaped together, the weight of empire pressed harder with each passing season. His eyes grew distant. His correspondence grew shorter. The borders continued to expand, but his inner circle tightened. He was no longer the prince of Anshan, lit by vision and flame. He was the emperor of 10 million souls, weighed down by decisions no mortal could fully carry. Cassandane worried not only for him, but for the future. Empires were often strongest not in their rise, but in their moderation. And moderation, she knew, was the first casualty of fatigue. So she began preparing for absence, his, hers, or both. She intensified her mentorship of Atossa, not in courtly graces but in governance. She taught her how to read temple budgets, how to sense resentment in a crowd, how to argue in 3 languages without raising her voice. She showed her how to weigh threats not just by their size, but by their origin. She trained her not to rule, but to sustain. And in her own writings, Cassandane became more introspective. She no longer chronicled only policies or prayers. She recorded the names of women she had met, those who led temples, those who raised orphans, those who managed fields in their husband's absence. She wrote of midwives who calmed cities during plagues, of widows who translated sacred texts when scribes refused. These were her saints, not canonized, not sung, but remembered. She began signing her letters with a symbol, instead of a name. A small open circle, unbroken, surrounded by 4 dots. No one knew what it meant, and she never explained it. But it appeared on scrolls from Susa to Sardis, from Persepolis to Babylon. And when later generations uncovered these marks in the margins of ancient archives, they whispered a new name for her. Not queen, not priestess, but she who preserved the light. Because that was what she had done. In an age of expansion, she had defended stillness. In a world of swords, she had protected the silence of prayer. In a time when kings fought over cities, she had gathered the gods and given them shelter, not under her crown, but under her care. And so, as fires burned in temples from Bactria to the Levant, each different, each sacred, each enduring, they all burned within a single empire. And in the heart of that empire stood a woman whose flame never wavered, a queen of no single god, and therefore the queen of them all. Empires breathe. They expand with purpose and contract with consequence, pulsing like a living organism across landscapes and lifetimes. And like any organism, the Achaemenid Empire, so vast now that a horse could ride 10 days in one direction and still remain beneath its banner, began to feel the strain of growth. Cassandane, more than anyone else, sensed it not in maps or military reports, but in the shifting rhythm of the court, in the flicker of Cyrus's voice, in the silent spaces between victories. The West had burned hot and fast. Lydia's opulence consumed, Babylon's pride cooled. But to the east, the air had turned cold, slow, resistant not in defiance, but in distance. Ice had formed not on roads or rivers, but in the arteries of control. Cyrus, ever pulled forward by the horizon, had begun to speak less of consolidation and more of completion. With Babylon secured, and the gods of 100 cities now housed within his protection, he cast his gaze to the far lands of Central Asia, where nomadic tribes moved like wind over mountains, and kings were measured not by palaces but by blood. To many in his court, these tribes were obstacles, irritants, insignificant compared to the grandeur of Susa or Sardis. But to Cyrus, they represented a final frontier, not merely of geography but of philosophy. If the empire could reach even the wildest edges of the world and still offer justice, still preserve dignity, then its foundation would be unshakable. Cassandane did not oppose the vision. She had always believed that the empire's strength lay in its inclusiveness, in its refusal to govern by fear. But she feared the pace. The West had fallen through policy and principle, but also through good fortune. Lydia's vanity, Babylon's negligence. These had made conquest inevitable. The East, however, was different. It was not decadent. It was not fractured. It was indifferent. The tribes of the steppes did not seek empires to join or gods to appease. They sought survival, movement, honor. And such people, she knew, did not yield to declarations carved in stone. As the court prepared for Cyrus's eastern campaign, Cassandane remained behind in Pasargadae. She could have accompanied him, as she had in earlier expeditions, but her health, subtle at first, had begun to fray. There was no dramatic decline, no diagnosis, only fatigue that never lifted, a quiet ache in the bones, and dreams that clung too tightly to waking thought. But more than illness, it was intuition that kept her from following. She knew the empire had reached a pivot. It was not a time for movement. It was a time for stillness, and she would serve as its anchor. She continued her work with the assembly of temples, now more influential than ever. She drafted recommendations for the standardization of weights and measures across provinces. She commissioned a new series of scrolls chronicling the empire's founding myths, one for each language group, tailored to local sensibilities. She expanded her mentorship of Atossa, who had grown into a woman of sharp intellect and soft edges, a rare balance Cassandane had cultivated with deliberate care. But it was in the silences of the palace that Cassandane felt the shift most acutely. Reports from the east were irregular, sometimes contradictory. Tribes once believed neutral had united in seasonal alliances. Rivers once deemed navigable had frozen too soon. Trade slowed, so too did letters from Cyrus. When they came, they were brief, factual, devoid of the philosophical musings that had once colored his thoughts. He spoke of distances, of climate, of negotiation tactics. He did not speak of vision. And Cassandane, reading between the lines, saw what few others dared name. Cyrus was not only pushing against new enemies, he was pushing against the limits of his own design. The empire had grown too large for a single mind to govern, too varied for even the most enlightened policy to satisfy all. The trust that held the empire together, between ruler and subject, between soldier and state, between the many tongues and the single throne, was beginning to stretch. It had not yet torn, but hairline fractures were emerging. She responded as she always had, by deepening her focus. She convened private councils of educators and mid-level administrators, urging them to prioritize local empowerment over imperial centralization. She began drafting a new kind of document, not edicts, but philosophical treatises on governance. These writings, addressed to no one and yet everyone, outlined principles that could survive the death of a king. They spoke of humility as policy, of law as a living organism, of rulers as stewards rather than architects. One such manuscript, later called the Doctrine of Balance, would go on to influence generations of administrators across the empire. In it, Cassandane wrote, "A fire burns brightest when fed with breath, not wind. So too must empires breathe, not blaze. Let the people shape the laws they obey, and they will guard them better than any army." But her influence, though vast, could not shield her from the truth. The court had grown impatient. Young nobles, born after the conquests, saw the empire not as a miracle but as an inheritance. They spoke in the language of permanence, forgetting that permanence is always an illusion. They pushed for expansion, for tribute, for glory. Cassandane saw in them the fire she had once respected, but now feared. Fire, without moderation, consumes its own foundations. Her health continued to falter. The palace physicians offered herbs, rest prayers. She accepted them all with grace, knowing none would restore what time had begun to take. She no longer joined the public processions, no longer presided over festivals. She spent her days among scrolls, her nights beneath the open sky, watching the stars shift in patterns that only she seemed to understand. Atossa sat with her often, bringing reports from the outer provinces, asking questions Cassandane was grateful to hear. The girl, now a woman, was ready. But readiness was not guarantee. Then, without fanfare, a courier arrived with word from the Eastern Front. Cyrus had crossed the Oxus River. He had engaged the Massagetæ. The battle had been hard, casualties heavy, but the campaign would continue. The message ended with a single line, "All is proceeding." Cassandane read the line over and over, said everything, and nothing. She lit a flame in her chamber that night, as was her ritual, and watched it flicker against the bronze walls. The empire had reached its zenith. She could feel it, not in the pride of expansion, but in the quiet tremble of consequence. Fire in the west, ice in the east. The boundaries of what they had built were no longer physical. They were spiritual, psychological, moral, and they were approaching their limit. She picked up her stylus and began to write. Not for the court, not for Cyrus, but for Atossa. "There will come a time," she began, "when the walls we built must hold not only soldiers and scribes, but stories. Tell them gently, tell them completely, and never forget that your mother was not a queen. She was a witness." She wrote deep into the night, and the empire breathed on. The signs were quiet at first, subtle like the shifting winds before a sandstorm. They were not felt in proclamations or on battlefields, but in the tone of letters, in the sudden delays in response, in the slow erosion of clarity within the rhythms of rule. Cyrus's messages from the east, once crisp and urgent, now arrived in fractured intervals. Reports grew less precise. Victories were declared but not detailed. Routes were marked as secure, yet caravans moved cautiously, shadows stretching longer along the empire's edges. Cassandane recognized the rhythm before anyone else. Not the rhythm of war, but the unmistakable, lingering cadence of fatigue. Power, she had always believed, was not gained in conquest, but in bearing. And now, after decades of expansion, the empire bore the weight of its own greatness. It was too vast for any one mind to survey, too interconnected for a single will to hold steady. In cities once freshly absorbed, Sardis, Babylon, Ecbatana, governors found themselves not contending with rebellions, but with confusion. Which law applied where? Whose version of justice took precedence in a land with 3 temples and 4 languages? The vision she and Cyrus had shaped, of a realm bound by pluralism, dignity, and order, was still intact, but its scaffolding trembled. At the heart of that trembling stood Cyrus himself, farther now from the man she had first known than any geographic distance could measure. His letters still bore affection, but there was a new edge to them, a harshness tempered not by anger, but by exhaustion. He no longer inquired about temple councils or educational reforms. He asked only of supplies, of loyalty, of time. The campaign in the far northeast had not broken him, but it had hollowed something within him, something vital. He had begun, it seemed to her, to govern by necessity rather than vision, and that, she feared, was the true illness of power, not cruelty but indifference. Cassandane's own health had weakened to the point where courtiers walked more quietly around her chambers. Servants no longer asked if she would attend public events. Physicians lingered longer than they should. Yet there was no specific ailment, no diagnosis they could name. Her mind remained sharp. Her hands still guided styluses across parchment with graceful control. But her body had become resistant to rest, slow to recover, fragile against the ordinary elements. She did not fight it. She had known, for years, that her time would not be measured in days, but in echoes. She spent her waking hours preparing, not for death but for transfer. Power, she understood, was not something one passed like a title. It had to be translated. To Atossa, she offered not counsel, but witness. She allowed her daughter to sit beside her during audiences, to review correspondence from distant provinces, to question the logic behind judgments made long ago. They spoke rarely of the future in abstract terms. Instead, Cassandane focused on cultivating instinct, on helping Atossa feel the rhythm of the empire the way a musician feels tempo or a sailor feels wind. To Cambyses, her eldest son and heir to the throne, she sent letters. They were not lectures. She knew his temperament, ambitious, proud, bound more tightly to the legacy of conquest than the morality behind it. She did not attempt to reshape him, but she planted reminders of the laws that must outlive him, of the temples he must not touch, of the scholars who kept the stories from unraveling. You will inherit his world, she wrote in one parchment sealed with her own signet, but you will not inherit his peace. That must be made again and again or not at all. Outside her chambers, the court moved on, as it always did. Festivals were planned. Treaties were celebrated. Envoys arrived with gifts and returned with promises. But beneath the rituals, a quiet dread gathered. The court had grown accustomed to Cassandane's presence. Her quiet interventions, her balancing hand, her fluency in the politics of grace. With Cyrus far away and no queen in full view, the palace seemed to sway in her absence, even as she remained within its walls. One evening, as dusk settled over the gardens of Pasargadae, she asked to be taken outside. It had been weeks since she last stepped into open air. Carried by servants who treated her as reverently as they did sacred relics, she was placed beneath a tree planted decades earlier, a myrtle bush she and Cyrus had chosen together after their return from Ecbatana. She asked to be left alone, and there, with the scent of old roots and earth around her, she began her final letter to Cyrus. She did not speak of love, though it was woven through every sentence. She did not speak of death, though its shadow hovered over her hands. Instead, she wrote of stewardship, of the danger of fatigue, of the delicate balance between legacy and illusion. She reminded him of their first debates, of their shared conviction that mercy was strength and justice a discipline. She reminded him that even kings must kneel, not before gods but before time. You are not the empire, she wrote. You are the breath that gave it life. But even breath must rest. She signed the letter not with her name, but with the open circle and 4 dots she had adopted years ago, a symbol now found on temple scrolls and administrative reports from Bactria to Babylon, a mark that meant preservation, continuity, the unseen foundation beneath great stone monuments. She slept little that night. The dreams, when they came, were gentle. In one, she walked a road lit with lanterns, each one bearing the face of a god she had once heard named in prayer. None spoke, but each nodded as she passed. By morning, her hands were too weak to hold the stylus. She dictated her last thoughts to a scribe she trusted with silence. She spoke not of herself, but of the stories yet to be written. She instructed that her letters be preserved, not in the palace archives, but in the temple libraries, alongside hymns and harvest records and healing chants. Let them be remembered, she whispered, as part of the breath of the world. And then, one day not long after, as the sun rose pale over the eastern mountains, Cassandane closed her eyes and did not open them again. No proclamation was issued immediately. No funeral parade was prepared. For a time, the palace simply held its breath. And then, across the empire, something remarkable happened. In temples of every kind, in ziggurats and fire sanctuaries, in shrines carved from stone and tents pitched in the wind, priests offered silent rites. Candles were lit in Babylon. Ash was marked on foreheads in Susa. A prayer inscribed in 3 languages was recited across the cities. She who held the flame has passed. Let the light remain. When word reached Cyrus, far from home, It is said he sat alone for many hours. His commanders waited. His scribes did not interrupt. No letter survives from that day. Only a change in the pace of his campaign, a retreat, a redirection, a sudden weariness woven into every future order. The illness of power had taken its toll. But the cure, perhaps, had always been her. She was gone, and yet the world did not end. The sun rose as it always had, casting long shadows across the stepped palaces of Pasargadae, touching the tips of ziggurats in Babylon and the roof tiles of Sardis, glinting off the helmets of guards standing at distant outposts where the name of Cassandane had never been spoken but where her decisions had still shaped the world. In the weeks following her death, a stillness settled over the empire, not of paralysis, but of pause. There was no decree, no trumpet, no ritual announcement of loss. Yet the air shifted subtly and absolutely, as if the empire itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years, only to discover it no longer knew how to inhale. The first signs of mourning did not come from the palace. They came from the outer cities. In Susa, the priests of Inshushanak, who had once considered the Persian fire cult foreign and intrusive, draped their altars in black cloth. In Babylon, the scribes in the temple of Marduk copied a prayer to a nameless woman, whose hand preserved the covenant of gods and men. In Sardis, Lydian merchant guilds halted trade for 3 days, not out of obligation, but because the letters they had once received, marked only with a mysterious open circle, no longer came. And in small farming villages where the queen's name had never been heard, but where her grain policies had kept children from starving, elders lit fires and sat in silence, without knowing why their hands trembled. The court itself was slow to respond, caught between protocol and awe. There were no rules for mourning a queen who had never claimed a throne. There were no scripts for how to bury a woman whose authority had been moral, whose reach had been unseen but unquestioned. Cyrus's return from the eastern frontier was delayed by geography and grief. For nearly 2 weeks, the palace remained suspended in ritual ambiguity, unwilling to proceed with business as usual, unable to declare anything official. Ministers tiptoed. Scribes waited. Atossa wept alone. When Cyrus finally arrived, his caravan stripped of triumph and shielded by dust, he did not enter the palace through the royal gate. He passed through the garden walls instead, walking alone until he reached the chamber where Cassandane's body had been kept. She lay not on a throne or altar, but on a stone bench carved decades earlier beneath a myrtle tree, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes closed in a peace he had not seen on her face in years. He remained beside her for a full day and night. No one approached, not even Atossa. What passed through his mind in those hours no scroll ever recorded. But when he emerged, the empire began to mourn, not because he ordered it to, but because something in his silence made mourning possible. He did not summon scribes. He did not issue royal edicts. He simply called for her writings to be copied, in every language spoken within the empire's reach. He ordered that the symbol she had adopted, an open circle with 4 dots, be engraved on every new stone laid in public works for a year. He asked that no temple be desecrated, rebuilt, or taxed during the same span. And then he declared a single line, to be posted in marketplaces, inscribed above city gates, recited by teachers and priests and governors alike. She preserved what I could only protect, from the Mediterranean coast to the Oxus River, from the fields of Lydia to the gates of Bactra. The empire moved in rhythm with its loss, not in sorrow alone but in memory. Mourning became action. Governors forgave small debts. Local rulers held open courts for the poor. Temples opened their doors to refugees without documentation. Scribes recorded oral histories from women who had never before been asked to speak. The mourning of Cassandane was not centralized. It flowed through the channels she had spent her life carving into the structure of the state. And yet, beneath the gestures of grief, something deeper stirred, a reckoning. For in the absence of her voice, the court began to hear, clearly and terribly, the noise she had long silenced, the ambition of men unchecked, the hunger of young nobles impatient for war. the inefficiencies in systems too vast to navigate without her guiding hand. And Cyrus, though still emperor, seemed diminished. Not by weakness, but by solitude. He had not merely lost a partner. He had lost his second sight, his balance, his sounding board. The policies he proposed in the weeks following her death were precise but less generous. His decisions quicker but more brittle. He still ruled justly but no longer gently. Atossa noticed it most. She had inherited her mother's mind, but not yet her mother's presence. And now, with the full burden of legacy falling upon her shoulders, she found herself watching the court through a different lens, not as a pupil but as a protector. She continued her mother's projects, sending funds to temple schools, commissioning new translations of sacred texts, ensuring that laws passed in distant provinces carried the same tone of respect Cassandane had demanded. But she also prepared for storms her mother had once deflected with a glance. Cassandane's tomb was built in quiet stages, not as a monument but as a place of refuge. It stood not far from Cyrus's own future resting place, carved into the earth with the same minimalism she had lived by. No gold, no statues, only a polished stone slab, inscribed with her symbol and a single line, "Guardian of the Flame, Servant of the Many." Pilgrims came not to leave offerings, but to sit in stillness. It became known not as a royal tomb, but as a sanctuary of silence. Even centuries later, when wars would sweep across Persia and new dynasties rise and fall, the tomb would remain untouched, because no one ever truly ruled it. In Babylon, a tablet was discovered generations later, bearing an inscription in multiple languages. Scholars debated its origin, but the content was unmistakably hers. Let the empire endure not because it is feared, but because it is remembered as fair. Let the law bend before cruelty breaks it. Let no god be honored by the suffering of those who walk in dust. It was not signed, but the open circle and 4 dots marked the final line. Years would pass. Cyrus would continue to campaign, to shape the edges of the known world. But those closest to him would mark the beginning of his decline not by defeat, but by her death. Not because he faltered, but because the fire she had kept steady began, slowly and irreversibly, to flicker. The empire she helped shape endured, for centuries, but the balance, the breath, the quiet logic, the unseen gravity was hers alone. And as the empire mourned across lands and languages, Cassandane did not become myth. She became memory, not a goddess, not a martyr, but a woman who changed the shape of the world without ever needing to be seen by it. The silence Cassandane left behind was not absence. It was an echo that shaped every decision made in her wake. Her memory lingered in the halls of Pasargadae like a perfume that clung to tapestries, not overwhelming, not sweet, but grounding. She had departed, but the architecture of her influence remained standing. And Cyrus, though still revered as a conqueror, had become something quieter, heavier. His voice no longer carried with it the weight of dreams. It carried instead the gravity of memory. The world had changed, and so had he, not in power but in posture. Even before word arrived from the far northeast, the court understood that Cyrus would not rest. He had spent a lifetime in motion, not simply across terrain, but across ideas. The West had been consumed in fire, Lydia's riches, Babylon's glory. The South yielded through diplomacy, but the East remained, still untamed, still vast and unknown, a mirror to the early chapters of his ambition. It was not greed that drove him now, nor glory. It was restlessness, the kind that does not seek to expand but to finish. As if somewhere beyond the Oxus, beyond the mountain passes and silent steps, there waited the final piece of a puzzle only he could see. In Pasargadae, the whispers began even before Cyrus formally announced the campaign. Advisors hesitated to challenge him, though many wished to. Cassandane had been their compass, and without her, uncertainty grew louder. Atossa remained steady, but she was not yet queen, not yet sovereign. And so the court prepared, as it always had, obedient but uneasy. The eastern tribes, particularly the Massagetes, had long been considered impossible to conquer. Not because they were militarily dominant, but because they were elusive. They lived not in cities, but in rhythm with rivers and seasons, moving as smoke and wind, governed by customs that did not fear death, but danced with it. Cyrus knew this. He had spent years hearing the stories. He understood the futility of marching a civilization into a landscape that refused to be ordered. But something beyond strategy called him. Some quiet compulsion that no one could name, not even he. And so, as the snows began to melt in the mountain passes and the northern rivers thawed, he departed, not with fanfare, but with grim determination. His army followed him like a shadow, loyal but cautious. They had seen him transform kingdoms. They had never seen him without her. The campaign unfolded slowly, not in battles, but in encounters. Villages appeared like mirages and vanished just as easily. Negotiations were attempted, but yielded little. The Massagetes, led by Queen Tamaris, did not seek diplomacy, nor did they initiate conflict. They simply waited. The tension for Cyrus was unbearable. A lifetime of control, of shaping outcomes, could not penetrate a people who refused to be shaped. He grew impatient. Reports from the front became contradictory, his orders less measured. It was then, in the chaos of uncertainty, that he made the decision that would define the end of his reign. A deception, small in execution but vast in consequence. A feast offered to lure the enemy. A show of hospitality masking strategy. Wine and food left behind in a staged retreat, meant to entice and weaken the Massagetes. The trap worked. A division of their army, including the queen's son, fell into it. They were captured, and when the young man, ashamed of defeat and fearing dishonor, took his own life in captivity, the queen's reply was not negotiation. It was vengeance. What followed was not a battle, it was retribution. The Massagetes attacked with a fury not of conquest, but of mourning. The Persian army, unaccustomed to chaos without Cassandane's moral restraint, held the line, but something was missing. Cyrus, though present, seemed distant, distracted, a man not commanding, but witnessing. The old instincts still lived in his hands, in his voice, in his knowledge of war. But the edge was gone. He had become, unknowingly, the man Cassandane had always warned him not to become, a king whose judgment had grown too heavy with years, too clouded with memory. In the final clash, on a field whose name history did not bother to preserve, Cyrus fell. Not in spectacle but in silence. There are many accounts. Some say he was pierced by a single arrow, others that he was struck down amid a storm of blades. But none could agree on his last words, because none were spoken. His death, like Cassandane's, arrived not with a cry, but with a breath. The news traveled slowly, not because of distance, but because of disbelief. An empire so tightly wound around one man could not easily accept his mortality. For days, the court at Pasargadae refused to act. Not until his body, wrapped in silence, was returned under escort did the mourning truly begin. But it was a mourning different from Cassandane's. Hers had spread like a shared memory, activating the rituals of reverence across languages and traditions. His was deeper but narrower. A shock, not a song. Atossa received the news with composure. She did not weep publicly. She did not collapse. Instead, she entered her mother's chamber, preserved exactly as it had been since the day of her passing, and sat at her desk. She unsealed a scroll Cassandane had left behind, one marked with her personal symbol, meant to be opened only upon Cyrus's death, contained no instructions, only reflections, warnings, and a final line: "The fire passes to you now. Hold it high, and hold it carefully." The funeral rites for Cyrus were unprecedented. Every city wanted to claim a piece of his memory. In Babylon, priests read from the ancient tablets of kingship, declaring that Cyrus had not only fulfilled but surpassed the expectations of divine order. In Sardis, statues were cloaked in black. In Susa, children were taught his name alongside those of mythical heroes. But in Pasargadae, where his tomb was to be built, simple, enduring, marked only by stone and sky, it was Atossa who oversaw every detail. She ensured that no gold was used, that no god's name was invoked above others. Only one inscription was carved, in 3 languages. Here lies Cyrus, king of kings, who gave to many, and took little. Beside his tomb, Cassandane's sanctuary stood quietly. No crowds gathered there. No declarations were made. But those who visited often left behind folded pieces of cloth, tiny tokens of silence. The empire, for all its breathless size, bowed for the first time not in fear, but in reverence. The last campaign had ended, and with it the era of the dreamers. What remained was their legacy, and those who dared to preserve it. Death had taken them both, first Cassandane, then Cyrus, but it had not taken what they had built together. The Achaemenid Empire, vast beyond comprehension, fragile beyond appearance, endured. Yet in the stillness that followed the last campaign, it did not roar forward as it once had. It did not expand. It exhaled. And as it did, the power that once radiated from a single figure, reinforced by a single voice, dispersed into many hands. For the first time in its history, the empire stood not on ambition, but on memory. And in that memory, it was Cassandane, not Cyrus, who proved to be the more enduring architect. Cambyses ascended to the throne, as had long been planned. He wore the crown with confidence, but not with ease. He had always been more soldier than statesman, more fire than breath. The laws Cassandane had helped shape were intact, but they no longer lived within the voice of the court. And though Cambyses followed many of her instructions, there was little in him of her restraint. He inherited the mechanisms of rule, but not the philosophy behind them. He wielded authority like a blade, not a torch. And the empire, sensing the change, began to tighten its posture. Yet amid the shifting tone of power, one current ran steady. Tossa, no longer just a daughter of the royal house, she emerged as something Cassandane had always known she would become. A steward not of titles, but of equilibrium. She held no throne, commanded no army, and yet every council chamber echoed with her presence. Governors sought her approval. Priests quoted her teachings. Administrators implemented policies she had revised with her mother years before. She became the keeper of continuity, the living bridge between an empire's origin and its uncertain future. In her private chambers, Atossa kept Cassandane's writings bound in leather, copied and recopied in multiple scripts. They were not formal laws, nor were they pure philosophy. They were something rarer, context. Notes about provinces, about the social fabrics of towns and cities, about the way certain words could be spoken in Susa but misunderstood in Sardis. She had written of people, not only places, of moods, not only measures. These were the maps no general could read, the scrolls no conqueror could write. And Atossa understood that within them lived the true boundaries of the empire, not lines drawn in sand, but expectations, hopes, grievances, and traditions. Cassandane's legacy became most visible not in the proclamations of the court, but in the decisions made quietly, daily, across the empire's vast terrain. In a small town outside Babylon, a temple was preserved rather than repurposed, because a magistrate remembered a line from a scroll. Respect what is sacred, even when it is not yours. In an eastern province, a village avoided conscription riots because a young administrator, trained in the new civil academy Cassandane had envisioned, arranged fairer rotations. In the highlands of Media, scribes translated civic oaths into the local dialect for the first time, because a teacher had once been told, "Language is not a barrier, it is the path." And across all of Persia, the symbol she had adopted, the open circle with 4 dots, began to appear not just on government edicts, but on amulets, pottery, even children's toys. It became a cultural shorthand for balance, for wisdom, for preservation. Many did not know the name behind it, but they knew what it meant. And in this way, Cassandane did not become a figure of worship or myth. She became a compass, an ethic, a rhythm. Still, the empire was not free from turbulence. Cambyses, driven by his father's unfinished ambitions, began to look southward to Egypt. There, he saw not another culture to respect, but a challenge to subdue. Atossa counseled patience. She urged diplomacy, compromise, time. But her brother had tasted conquest, and it filled him with purpose. The invasion that followed would stretch the empire's resources, strain its infrastructure, and sow seeds of doubt in the very harmony Cassandane had worked so carefully to cultivate. Atossa knew she could not stop it, but she could prepare for what would follow. She doubled her efforts to protect the institutions her mother had established. She fortified the network of temple councils, ensuring that no single priesthood could be silenced or elevated unjustly. She strengthened the newly formed civil academies, training administrators who could mediate in times of conflict. She directed scribes to compile oral histories from women and elders across the provinces, preserving a record of life not as it was ruled, but as it was lived. Most of all, she sought to preserve Cassandane's example through her own presence. When disputes arose, she attended not as judge but as witness. When festivals occurred, she walked among the people, listening. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was with the cadence of her mother. Calm, precise, unmoving, and though she lacked a crown, she became the court's conscience. In one of her letters, later discovered in a temple archive near Persepolis, Atossa wrote, "My mother ruled without rule. She governed without title. She was obeyed not because she commanded, but because she convinced. I do not ask to be her equal, only her echo." The world around her continued to shift. Old alliances trembled. New powers emerged. Trade routes changed. But wherever the empire held, it held through the systems Cassandane had created, flexible, patient, respectful. Systems designed not to resist change, but to survive it. Her legacy endured in places even she had never seen. Along the edge of the Hindu Kush, a child recited a verse written in a script introduced by her scribes. In a port on the eastern Mediterranean, a merchant invoked her symbol to certify fairness in trade. In a courtroom in Susa, a judge quoted a ruling Cassandane had once made regarding water rights. And in Pasargadae, beneath the polished stones of her sanctuary, women left offerings not of gold or incense, but of folded scrolls, pledges to teach, to mediate, to remember. The tombs of great kings often outlive their empires, their faces carved into cliffs, their names etched into monuments. But Cassandane had left something more enduring than stone. She had left culture, policy, restraint, a way of seeing the world not as a prize to be won, but as a garden to be tended. And so, while the empire she helped birth continued to march, to battle, to triumph and stumble, her quiet legacy moved beneath it all. In every child who learned in a temple school, in every local leader who chose diplomacy over decree, in every scribe who translated before judging, her voice remained, not loud, not legendary, but eternal. Because empires fall, but ideas endure, and hers had become the soul of the realm. Empires leave behind ruins. Walls crumble, thrones are buried, names are lost to time. Yet sometimes, in the most unlikely places, in forgotten rooms, in broken soil, in fragments no longer guarded by armies, the memory of an idea survives. And when it does, it speaks not with the voice of power, but with the breath of principle. This was how Cassandane returned, not through monuments, but through clay. The scrolls she had written, the reforms she had guided, the doctrines she had whispered into the policies of kings, none had been carved in stone. Her legacy was always softer than that. It moved in customs, in gestures, in the quiet acts of restraint that never reached the scribes of glory. But there came a moment, after both she and Cyrus had vanished into the realm of memory, when the words they had lived by, her words, shaped by his voice, were hardened into something tangible, something that could survive time. A cylinder, made of baked clay, impressed with cuneiform, left to rest beneath the dust of Babylon. It would not be unearthed for millennia, Generations would pass without ever knowing of its existence. But when it was found, worn by age, chipped at the edges, the message it carried would strike like a whisper across centuries. Freedom, return, rebuild, worship without fear. It would come to be known in modern memory as the Cyrus Cylinder, the first declaration of human rights, the first official recognition by a ruler that dignity and belief must be honored even in conquest. But those who understood the rhythm of the empire, who had studied not just its battles but its silences, recognized something else. The words on that cylinder bore the cadence of another voice. Not the voice of a warrior, but of a woman who had once listened to the languages of the empire before they had ever been translated. A woman who had written not for legacy, but for stability. A woman who had never ruled, yet had governed the conscience of the state. Cassandane had never signed a decree. She had never addressed the masses from a dais. But the values expressed in the cylinder were hers. Freedom of religion, protection of heritage, the restoration of sacred spaces. The idea that authority must kneel before custom, that power must learn the language of the people it claims to serve. These were not conquests, they were inheritances. The cylinder itself made no mention of her name. It spoke of Marduk of Babylon, of peace after the fall of tyranny. But behind the script, between the lines, were fingerprints. The policy to return displaced peoples to their homelands, the order to rebuild their temples, the command that local governance be restored under imperial protection. None of these were decisions born in the heart of a battlefield. They were born in quiet rooms, years before, where Cassandane had instructed that faith and law could coexist, that empires must not silence the sacred, but protect it. When Cyrus walked into Babylon unchallenged, when he was welcomed not as a destroyer but as a deliverer, it was not his army that had earned that reverence. It was her preparation, her letters to priests, her quiet assurances to temple councils, her insistence that no god be erased. When the great walls of Babylon remained standing, it was because she had convinced her husband that victory without violence was not weakness, but triumph. And when the text of the cylinder was finally pressed into clay, by hands unknown, under the supervision of scribes loyal to an idea rather than a name, it was Cassandane's worldview that had survived the crucible of conquest. A worldview that had always refused to choose between strength and mercy. In the decades after her death, as the empire moved through turmoil, Cambyses' campaigns, the rise of Darius, revolts and reconciliations, Cassandane's name was mentioned less often. Her image faded from the public sphere, but her values remained embedded in the foundation of policy. Governors invoked her principles when making decisions that went beyond precedent. Temple councils continued to use the symbol she had chosen. And Atossa, her daughter, carried her teachings into a new generation, ensuring that whatever kings rose next, they would rise with a conscience. Centuries would pass. The empire would fall. Successor states would rise, claim descent from greatness and fracture. But beneath the ruins, in the dry earth of ancient Babylon, that clay cylinder waited. When it was finally unearthed, thousands of years later, it would spark debates. Was this truly the world's first charter of rights? Was Cyrus a visionary or simply pragmatic? But few would ask the more essential question. Whose voice guided his hand? Historians would marvel at the political maturity of the text, its unprecedented tolerance, its progressive recognition of ethnic and religious pluralism. They would compare it to the Magna Carta, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But none of those later documents had been written under siege or in the fragile moments after conquest. The cylinder had emerged from the most precarious moment an empire can face, the moment it is no longer fighting for land, but for legitimacy. And in that moment, it was Cassandane's compass that pointed the way. Today, when the cylinder sits behind glass, beneath lights designed to protect its clay from decay, it is often viewed as a relic of empire, a piece of propaganda, a symbol of Persia's ancient sophistication. But to those who know her story, it is something more. It is proof that silence does not mean absence, that influence is not always carved into monuments, but sometimes pressed into the hearts of those who choose to rule with care. Cassandane never held the cylinder in her hand, but her hand shaped the mind that made it. She did not speak its words, but its words spoke her soul. And so, as dust settles over the centuries, as empires continue to rise and fall, her legacy endures not in armies or thrones, but in the belief that a ruler must not only protect, but preserve. That justice is not an act, but a habit. That power must be guided not only by law, but by listening. She had listened, and the world remembered. History does not favor quiet hands. It prefers kings who carve borders, warriors who shatter empires, prophets who shout from mountaintops. It scours the battlefield for footprints but rarely enters the council room. It remembers coronations but forgets conversations. And thus, while the name of Cyrus endures in marble and in textbooks, the name of Cassandane, like so many queens before and after her, is carried not on the wind of proclamation, but on the still breath of remembrance. She was not the first woman to shape an empire from within the seams of power, and she would not be the last. But among the many names lost to time, priestesses who guided rituals, mothers who held lineages together, negotiators who calmed tempers before battles ever began, Cassandane stood at a singular junction. Her world was vast, tangled, young in its ambition but old in its tensions. And she met it not with the force of command, but with the discipline of insight. The records would not show her debating generals or sitting in judgment, yet her influence outlasted those who did. Her contemporaries knew her power. In letters never intended for public viewing, governors referred to her presence as a compass. Priests invoked her judgment when settling disputes between temples and cities. Traders trusted her word more than the gold-backed seals of satraps. But time, ever hungry for names attached to wars and monuments, stripped her from the great narrative, relegating her to footnotes, to speculation, to silence. And yet her voice remained, not in a singular tone but in chorus. In the women who came after her, some royal, some obscure, who carried forward the tools she left behind, patience, restraint, a ruthless clarity of purpose. Women who understood that holding together a world often demanded more strength than breaking it apart. There was Atossa, her daughter, who in the decades after Cyrus's death would become not only queen, but queen mother, a power behind the throne of kings. She was not her mother's echo, she was her evolution. Trained not just in words, but in systems, she ensured the survival of the empire through transition, securing Darius's place on the throne, not through bloodshed, but through legitimacy, marrying vision with inheritance. Her mother had taught her to view power not as possession, but as responsibility. She passed that lesson into a lineage that would stretch through the veins of Persian royalty for generations. There were others less known. A priestess in Bactria who recorded Cassandane's teachings in local script, adapting them into hymns about stewardship and balance. A widow in Sardis who modeled her house into a school for girls, placing above the entrance a symbol of 4 dots and an open circle, carved in wood. A female magistrate in Susa centuries later who cited Cassandane in legal commentary, arguing that justice must bend with mercy, or else it is no justice at all. These women did not claim her mantle. They carried her motion, even outside Persia. Her influence seeped through trade and tradition. Greek historians, often dismissive of Eastern rulers, wrote cautiously respectful lines about the unusual stability and tolerance of the early Persian court. They attributed it to Cyrus, but what they described, the multilingual edicts, the protected temples, the forums of shared law, bore the unmistakable structure of her governance. The outlines of her presence etched themselves into the stories of foreign lands, where queens were often vilified or ignored, but her style, deliberate, generous, unsparing in logic, was adopted in pieces, even if the source remained unnamed. And still, even in her homeland, her memory began to fade into ritual. Her sanctuary remained, a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who wished to reflect, not petition, but fewer remembered the woman beneath the stone. Her teachings, absorbed into the foundation of law and custom, were no longer seen as hers. They were simply Persian. The open circle became a neutral symbol. The scrolls bearing her philosophies were copied, then paraphrased, then distilled into maxims and protocols devoid of authorship. This, too, was a kind of triumph. She had never sought credit. Her concern had always been continuity, and in this, she succeeded beyond measure. Her values were no longer her own. They had become the empire's. But every so often, in hidden places, private libraries, forgotten tombs, temples buried under centuries of ash and soil, a name re-emerged. Cassandane. A whisper between scribes. A note in the margin of a scroll. A mother's name passed down through generations, even as its meaning grew uncertain. In one such scroll, preserved in a temple far to the west, a passage written in Median script describes a woman who walked with kings but knelt to none, whose voice was softer than command, but stronger than fear. And in that line she lived again. For the forgotten queens of history do not vanish. They are buried but not erased. Their voices become harder to hear, not because they were silent but because the world stopped listening. Cassandane was never silent. She simply spoke in a language of systems, of relationships, of design, a language that does not fit easily into the poetry of war or the metaphors of conquest. But for those who know where to look, she remains. In the line of a law that considers mercy before judgment. In the hand of a ruler who listens before commanding. In the architecture of a state that survives not by fear, but by faith. Cassandane's voice, like so many of her sisters in forgotten history, was not erased. It was woven, and in the quiet moments when empires doubt their foundations, when kings wonder what justice truly demands, when scholars brush dust from ancient words and find principles that still breathe, her voice returns. Low, steady, unyielding. The empire continued. Stones were still laid. Roads still wound their way through mountains and deserts. Tributes still crossed rivers on the backs of camels and were stacked in palaces gleaming with the wealth of 100 nations. Kings rose. Battles were waged. Borders shifted. And yet, amid the weight and noise of dynasties growing louder, something more essential moved beneath it all. Something quieter than law, older than lineage, stronger than steel. It was the memory of order without oppression, strength without cruelty, and leadership without pride. It was Cassandane, still present, even though the empire now breathed without her. When Darius rose to power after the turbulent years that followed Cambyses, it was not with the clean grace of succession, but with calculation. His rule, though visionary in its own right, carried the marks of consolidation, military efficiency, administrative rigor, new cities rising from bare stone. He was a builder of infrastructure, of imperial clarity. But even Darius, ambitious and austere, understood that legitimacy could not be imposed, only maintained. And so, in his reforms, in his engravings, in the laws carved into cliffs for future generations, echoes of Cassandane returned, not as citation but as compass. Her writings, though by then rarely attributed to her name, had become the marrow of empire. Every satrapy managed according to its own customs. Every temple protected, whether fire altar or ziggurat. Every edict translated into the languages of those it would touch. She had not merely imagined a multi-ethnic empire. She had designed its grammar. Her worldview had taken root in the subconscious of a state that had outgrown her lifetime, but not her wisdom. And yet, as decades turned to centuries, her name passed further into the margins. Atossa would preserve her memory, and through Atossa's son, Xerxes, the blood of Cassandane would still sit on the throne. But blood does not preserve thought, and the deeper into empire Persia walked, the more ceremonial memory became. Her sanctuary remained, tucked into the hills near Pasargadae, maintained by a small order of scribes and caretakers who never claimed royal patronage, but knew whom they served. It became a place not of pilgrimage, but of refuge, visited by those whose questions could not be answered by kings. There, the records of her philosophy were recopied. sometimes burned during regime shifts, sometimes buried during invasions, sometimes dismissed as irrelevant in the face of newer, hungrier ideologies. But always, somehow, they returned. Partial scroll found near Ecbatana. A whispered teaching passed from mother to daughter. A verse embedded in a trader's journal describing the four-dotted circle as a sign of fair measure in distant ports. Her influence was not static. It adapted, disguised, waited. Empires rose around her memory, then fell. Alexander would come, a storm out of Macedonia, burning with hunger for the world. He would weep at Cyrus's tomb, marvel at what Persia had built, and leave Cassandane's sanctuary untouched. Though he never knew her name, he would carry eastward a new model of kingship, more theatrical, less tempered. But even he could not destroy what had been embedded too deeply to burn. The idea that governance required more than control, that it demanded comprehension. Rome came later, and then the caliphates, and then even newer powers, each erasing what they could not use and glorifying what they could. But none of them could fully dislodge the template Cassandane had laid beneath the Persian state. Rule not from fear, but from understanding. Sustain power not through obedience alone, but through recognition. What made her legacy endure was not myth. It was usefulness. Her ethics worked. They solved problems. They endured stress. They traveled well. And though she had never claimed divinity, and never stood above the law, her name, when remembered, was spoken with reverence. Not because she had conquered, but because she had cared. There is a strange truth to history. The greater the restraint, the quieter the legacy. Cassandane lived in a world that did not know how to reward subtlety. It chronicled the roar of kings and the smoke of cities, but not the hand that steadied the blade before it was drawn. Yet it was precisely that hand that kept the empire from breaking before it could bloom. To say the empire lived without her is both true and misleading. Physically, yes, Persia endured for centuries, changed shape, fought wars, entered new ages. But the empire that was built in her time, under her unseen guidance, was never fully replicated. Later kings would attempt to emulate Cyrus's style, never realizing that his greatest strength had been his willingness to be guided. And what guided him was her. Cassandane did not leave behind a statue, or an army, or a shrine to her own glory. She left behind a way of thinking, passed quietly through the marrow of nations, into the instincts of governors and the codes of bureaucrats. She was not the mother of an empire by blood, but by structure. Not a queen in marble, but an architect in parchment and persuasion. Her story ends not with a death, but with dispersion, her thoughts, her principles, her example scattered into the DNA of a civilization that often forgot her name, but never stopped echoing her shape. And perhaps that is how she would have wanted it. Not to be remembered for her power, but for the peace her power protected. Not to be praised, but practiced. In the desert hills of modern-day Iran, where the wind carries dust over the remains of ancient palaces, the sanctuary still stands. A stone chamber, unassuming, facing east. Inside, no statue, only a niche in the wall, and a symbol above it. A circle, open, with 4 small points around its edge. No inscription, no glory, just a symbol, and a silence so deep, it speaks.